So, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues and dear guests, welcome back after the lunch break. As you can hear, this session is going to be in English. And before we start, I was asked to mention once again to tell all the people who are interested on the internet and are watching what's going on here to post their questions if they have one on the internet via email. So if we get here any questions concerning this panel or the next few panels, of course, and again tomorrow we'll collect here the questions and the panelists will give an answer on them. So welcome back, and now we have, according to our program, our first a session on the Soviet Union, which is, well, in terms of our edition, VEJ, the volumes 7 and 8. And I'm quite honored to introduce you to our two panelists who are equally outstanding experts on the history of the Holocaust in the Soviet Union and in the Soviet-occupied territories. And our first speaker will be Dr. Bert Hoppe, and I'm sorry that I've prepared his CV in German. Bert Hoppe war bis 2004 wissenschaftlicher Mitarbeiter am Institut für Geschichtswissenschaften der Humboldt-Universität zu Berlin, und zwar im Rahmen eines Projektes der Deutsch-Russischen Historikerkommission. Von 2005 an dann für mehrere Jahre Mitarbeiter am Editionsprojekt VEJ, dessen Ergebnisse Sie halt in Form der Bände 7 und 8, Band 7 in Zusammenarbeit mit Hildrun Glass, Sie hoffentlich oder vielleicht kennen oder auch noch kennenlernen werden. Und nach einigen Zwischenstationen, unter anderem als Autor und Lektor bei Rowohlt Berlin und anderen Verlagen sowie als Referent für Ost-, Mittel- und Osteuropa bei der Friedrich-Ebert-Stiftung, bearbeitet Bert Hoppe seit 2020 am Institut für Zeitgeschichte ein Forschungsprojekt zu Kiew im Krieg 1937 bis 1947, eine integrierte Untersuchung zu Gewaltherrschaft, Besatzung und Judenverfolgung. Zu seinen Forschungsschwerpunkten gehören neben NS-Geschichte, deutsch-sowjetische Beziehungen auch die Architekturgeschichte, und er hat zu allen Bereichen gleichermaßen breit publiziert. Ich erwähne nur die Titel Auf den Trümmern von Königsberg über Kaliningrad in der Nachkriegszeit bis 1970, dann in Stalins Gefolgschaft, Moskau und die KPD in der Zwischenkriegszeit, und zuletzt eine Architekturgeschichte Berlins, die 2019 erschienen ist. Dr. Arkadi Zeltser is currently director of the Moshe Mirilashvili Center for Research on the Holocaust in the Soviet Union of the International Institute for Holocaust Research at Yad Vashem in Jerusalem. His fields of interest are the Holocaust in the USSR, Soviet propaganda in Yiddish, which is especially interesting for me, during World War II, Jewish memory on the Holocaust, and Jewish-Gentile relations and the participations of Jews in the NKVD. He has broadly published on all these topics, and just to mention a few, is author of the book The Jews of the Soviet Provinces, Vitebsk and the Shtetls between 1917 and 1941, which came out still in Russian in 2006, then Unwelcome Memory, Holocaust Monuments in the Soviet Union, published by Yad Vashem in 2018. And he's also the editor of documents, namely of a collection of letters to pour out my bitter soul, letters from the USSR 1941 to 1945. And at the same time, he's co-editor of a collection of articles, Distrust, Animosity and Solidarity, Jews and non-Jews during the Holocaust in the Soviet Union, also published by Yad Vashem in 2016. At the moment, he's working on his next book entitled Memory in the Monuments, Soviet Jewish Identities in the Holocaust. So, you have the floor.
Yeah, thanks you very much for the introduction. introduction and for being here today, for listening to the presentation on the volumes 7 and 8. First, before I start to talk about the very volumes, I would like to mention two men I met during my research. Normally, we, as historians, we sit in the archives, work with papers, and in this case, it was very impressive for me, in one case to meet, and in another case to at least have some email correspondence with the two persons who are mentioned in the very documents I have found. The first one was the son of Adolf Alporovich from Liepaja in Latvia, Liebau in German. Adolf Alporovich was arrested in December 1941 and shot 5 days later. He was found in his apartment in a small chamber. When the policeman asked his wife about the whereabouts of her husband, she asked, how should I know, since the Germans kill all Jews? In the arrest reports was mentioned his two sons, teenage boys. One was Eduard, born in 1926, and I met him then later. So by chance I get contact to him. He lived since the end of the Second World War in the United States and became a professor for chemistry in Chicago. Edward Anders. The other one was Roman Kravchenko, who in 1941 lived in Kremenets in western Ukraine, also born in 1926. He has written a diary in which he documented how he has seen his Jewish girlfriend being deported from the ghetto and then finally shot. In 1944, he was enlisted to the Red Army, then as a young man, and has worked as a military interpreter in the Soviet occupation zone in Germany up to 1950. His niece was so kind to, he lived in Arkhangelsk, he died in 2011. His niece was so kind to photograph the original pages of his diary, which is kept in the regional museum in Kremenets. So first, I think I would like to spend some words about the division between the volumes number 7 and 8, because often when I talk to people about these two volumes, there's some confusion. And although this has not been my decision how to do this division, but of the editors, for me it seems rather logical. We have here the general map of the whole project from yesterday. There are three main points I would like to talk about. First, these two volumes include all Soviet territories at the time of the German invasions. That means also the annexed territories, which used to be either Poland or Romania, and of course the Baltic states. Second, the territories which were later handed over to the Generalgouvernement or to the German Reich are, and all events that have happened in this time are dealt with in these volumes. And therefore the division between the volume 7 and 8 is that in the volume 7 the events are dealt which happened under the military administration and in the Baltic states, and in the volume number 8 mainly what happened under the civil administration in today's Belarus and Ukraine. That means that the borders which I refer to in my two volumes are not today's borders. It means that large parts of Western Ukraine belong to the volume number 9, I guess, from on Poland. So, if you have a short look on the map, you can see that it's a rather huge area covered in these 2 volumes, from the Baltic Sea to the Caucasus and to the Black Sea. Yesterday, when Susanne Heim mentioned the 21 languages, I think I wondered if this is true, because only in my 2 volumes we have 14 languages. So also included the Swedish, the articles written in Swedish language, and so on. So another point is the general theme, which could be seen in the 2 volumes I have worked on. Yesterday was already mentioned the radicalization, and the radicalization is the main theme of the 7th volume, the period in which the anti-Jewish terror was expanded to a full-size genocide against the Jews. This can be read by the fate of Leopold Silberstein, who was a German Jew, a member of the German Democratic Party, Liberal Party, in 1928 to 1930. In 1933, he emigrated to Prague. In 1937, he emigrated to Estonia, where he worked as a lecturer of Slavonic languages. And in July 1941, he was then caught first by the Estonian security police and then handed over to the Germans and shot in July 41. So the volume 7 thus describes how the within weeks, or even in some cases in some days, the terror developed to a full-size genocide. Already before the invasion, the Nazi leadership has defined the Soviet territories as a sphere where the all rules of warfare, which were still obliged to in the West, didn't count anymore. The Jews, thus, as a part of the civilians in these areas, were the more already defined as illogical opponents, and therefore the violence was from the very beginning mainly directed against them. What is very special about the development of violence was that the commanders of the killing units, which were sent into the Soviet territories, had a wide room for maneuver. From the very beginning, the orders given to the commanders were deliberately left unclear. They had the room for maneuver how they defined as target, and so they could expand also the groups of victims at their will. And the key document in this respect is the Schnellbrief by Heydrich, where he gives a list of potential victims: Jews, communists, marauders, etc. So, and this etc. is the main word, so to say, in this document. The documents show how the murder actions expanded rather fast from the local intelligentsia to all Jews of military age, and then finally to the annihilation of whole communities in July and August 1941. What was an important factor in this radicalization of the violence were the self-created supposed constraints. So when the Germans have imprisoned Jews and cut them off of food supply, soon diseases broke out, and the Germans decided then that better than to spread diseases from these Jews, it would better to kill them off at once. And so we can see this way of violence from the Baltics, where Jews were sealed off in the synagogue, in Kharkiv in December 41, where in midwinter people were then put into a former factory. And already in summer 1941, one of the rather well-known cases in Biela Tserkov, where all adult Jews already had been killed, and only some infants were left in a room. And then there was a discussion among the Germans what to do with the Jews, with these small children, and then they had to be killed because there was nobody who could care of them. What is also specific for the Holocaust in these occupied Soviet territories was, it was, so to say, handwork. And the perpetrators regarded their murder actions as work, as necessary work. And most of us, or all of us, probably know Himmler's notorious speech before the SS leaders in Poznan, Posen at that time, where he referred to some cases of human weakness. And this was where he referred to people, to the perpetrators who, like, for example, one of the main commanders, Erich von dem Bach-Zelewski, received some trauma by their own deeds. So, and therefore, this murder work was regarded as something which should be reserved to specialists, people who specialized in murdering Jews and other people. And what is interesting, of course, there were people, soldiers from the Wehrmacht, who wanted to participate at mass shootings, and there are several orders. For example, one from the commander of the Rear Army Territory from September 1941, who explicitly said, well, this is no business for ordinary soldiers, but this is only for the ZIPO and the SD. The volume 8 on the areas under civil administration in Belarus and Ukraine, central Ukraine, shows quasi the well-rehearsed, professionalized, mass murder up to the German withdrawal from these territories under the civil administration. And I will talk about one example, a report by an Ukrainian police officer who in early 1944 in detail described how these mass shootings happened. He talked near Kamenets-Podolsky in western Ukraine. He talked about how the Ukrainian auxiliary police was gathered the day before, and then in the next morning, together with the German gendarmen and security police, had a joint ride to the ghetto of destination, where they sealed off the ghetto, brought the Jews to the marketplace, where then the representative of the civil administration selected the still needed specialist, and the rest was then brought to a prepared pit outside, which has been dug out by local peasants, and there the people were murdered by one of these special groups and shot by one single person who was given all the new ammunition by another German policeman. And later, the Ukrainian policemen had to bring the clothing back to the city to distribute them, and the peasants had to refill the pit with some earth. So we see here a highly labor divided, so to say, mass killings. Within the volume, we have tried to bring a different perspective, documents which provide different perspective on one place or even one event. For example, on Drogobych in western Ukraine in July 1941, where Felix Landau, an SS officer, had a conflict with a Wehrmacht officer. And on the other hand, we have a report of the Jewish Council, the Judenrat, to the Wehrmacht in this area, where they reported about all the pogroms and violence against their community. Then we have the so-called liquidation of the ghetto of Pinsk, where we have farewell letter, one of the letters from a Jew, Elhan Einbinder, from October 1942 from the ghetto, and then two reports, one by an SS officer on his experiences in liquidating this ghetto, and with some hints how to find Jews who were hiding in the basements, and a recollection of a non-Jewish doctor who had contacts to his Jewish colleagues at the time where the ghetto was still, I don't know, not working, was still there, and how he could see from the upper window of his hospital how the Jews were brought to the execution. And then finally, the Aktion 1005, when the Germans tried to annihilate even the corpses of the people they murdered. We have the report of one of the survivors, Vladimir Davidov, who had to burn the corpses in the Babin Yar pit, ravine near Kiev, and a transmission by Radio Moscow, which was sending in German trophy documents, which were exactly talking about how to dig out the corpses and burn them. So we have these different perspectives which are partly complement, partly confirm each other, and which provide then the context, especially regarding, for example, for the perspective of the bystanders. Because when we, in a lot of these documents, we learn not only about the crimes against the Jews, but also about the deportation of so-called Ostarbeiters to Germany, about the partisan warfare, about the mass shootings of non-Jews. And from these reports, we also learn that for non-Jewish people, the mass shooting of Jews was just one crime among others. And especially if you look on the later war, anti-partisan warfare, when sometimes the number of non-Jews which were killed were bigger than the Jews, because most of the Jews have been killed anyway, and the Jews they killed during these mass shootings were people who managed to escape from the ghettos or to the forest and were then just killed with the others. So some words to the various sources, on the sources by the victims, by the perpetrators, and by the Soviet documents. a problem we have with the sources by victims for the area of the Soviet occupied territories is that the far east we go, in Ukraine and Belarus especially, the faster the Germans have annihilated all Jews that they could find. So in most cases the victims hadn't any time to write at least letters, let alone diaries. And the diaries we have at hand from the Soviet occupied territories are mainly from what is today Western Ukraine, Western Belarus, and the Baltics. But these documents are very important because they let us trace back how open and unclear the situation was for the people in the ghettos. For example, Hillel Margulis in Radun wrote about his arrival in the ghetto in 1941, not knowing what was expecting him, and just 2 months later he was wondering that he was then still alive. The diaries already show survival strategies, but also often their failure. The attempts to run, to hide in the forest was in many cases not successful because for so many people there was just not enough food in the forest. The partisans were not willing to take Jews in their groups, and so we have some documents in these 2 volumes where it is documented that people even who managed to escape from the execution pits didn't know where to go to and returned to the ghetto to wait for, so to say, for the next execution. The perpetrators' documents are sometimes very lengthy, sometimes they have just one single line on the killing of the Jews. And this shows also how the Holocaust became some kind of an everyday work of the perpetrators, because everybody knew, reading these documents, what was happening when, for example, so-called Kriegsgefangenen-Sammelstelle said, well, Jews 75 to the SD. So 75 Jews were handed over to the security service for execution. Zum Schluss kommen, ja. So, then a last word to the Soviet documents, because this is a very special, often a very special type of source, because we have, in some cases, we have reports from survivors who then reported to the NKVD about what they experienced in the ghettos, or from the perpetrators, for example, Ukrainian policemen, but we don't know exactly who is talking in these documents. The very persons or the NKVD officers who has written the reports. And in some cases, one document is on the forgery of documents by the NKVD, where an NKVD officer himself is complaining that they had forged a diary of a German soldier and just deleted all hints on the anti-Jewish violence from this diary. And therefore, this is one of the main factors you have to keep in mind when you read these Soviet documents in these 2 volumes. So,
yeah, thank you, Bert, for your paper. And now I'll pass to you, Arkadi. You have the floor.
First of all, I would like to thank the conference organizers for inviting me to the part in it and giving an opportunity to discuss the questions for the research of documentation of the Holocaust in the USSR. I would also like to express my admiration for the editors of the volumes on the USSR, Bert, Hoppe, and Hildrun Glass, and for the initiations of the project as a whole, for the matter. The two relevant volumes, 7 and 8, contain an enormous wealth of documents, 626 in total, along with highly detailed and extensive commentary. This documentary corpus is not just an impetus to discuss many questions, but also a rich material base for analyzing the peculiar features of the Holocaust in the USSR. Many of the documents are instructions and reports that bear the unmistakable imprint of Nazi indoctrination. Okay, thank you. As the editors correctly point out in the introduction, the documents indicate that the differences within the official Nazi policy vis-à-vis the Jews reflect not so much the doubts of agents as the absence of clearly formulated directives. Alternatively, they may be explained by institutional interests. A separate, quite sizable category of the published documents consists of testimonies submitted by Jews and local civilians. These testimonies given by individuals familiar with peculiarities of local life give us extensive and diverse material for studying both the local variations of the Holocaust and mental transformations experienced by people in the extreme conditions of the war in the East, which often took on brutal forms. Since the length of this presentation prevents me from the discussion many of the issues raised by these documents, I will limit myself to certain questions which may not be the central ones, but which I believe to be salient for understanding the proper way of working with materials on the history of the Holocaust in the USSR, mainly from the point of view of Jewish and Soviet history. Volume 7 and 8 are titled The Soviet Union and Annexed Territories. This title inevitably gives rise to the question, in the context of the Holocaust, what are the criteria for demarcating the borders of the Soviet Union? And accordingly, what kinds of documents should be included in such collections? Alongside the formal criterion of the official borders of the USSR in 1941, one distinguishing feature of the Holocaust throughout the territory was the emphasis on persecuting and murdering Jews as part of struggle against Judeo-Bolshevism, i.e. the way Nazi Germany itself defines the geographical extent of direct Soviet influence. The motive of fighting Judeo-Bolshevism is clearly articulated both in published orders by Nazi leaders and in the responses by local Holocaust perpetrators on the ground. As might be expected, this subject is taken up in detail in the analytical introduction of Volume 7. Another peculiarity that can justify grouping these diverse documents under a single Soviet heading is the fact that the bulk of the Jewish victims were murdered near their pre-war places of residence. A third criterion has to do with the German and Romanian administrative divisions during the occupation period. The volumes dealing with the USSR draw mostly on the materials from the military zone, Reichskommissariats Ostland and Ukraine, and the Romanian occupation zone, as well as documents referring to events in these territories. However, they also include documents dating to the summer of 1941 from the territory of East Galicia, which would soon become part of District Galician, and from the Bialystok region, which would be annexed to East Prussia. In the latter two regions, the bulk of the Jews were deported to the death camps in 1942-1943. Thus, the inclusion of these materials contradicts the preceding criterion, which groups the victims based on the manner of killing. The inconsistency clearly demonstrates that when studying the Holocaust, we are often forced to adopt ad hoc definitions of the borders of the USSR based on our specific research objectives. Do we regard Vilnius as part of Lithuania? Do we include the various regions of Ukraine and Belarus within the Soviet borders of 1941? Or conversely, do we exclude Bialystok, which was returned to Poland after the war? Occasionally, we even use the new borders drawn after the dissolution of the USSR. If we decide to adopt the notion of anti-Judeo-Bolshevism as the basis for our definition, indeed the notion may be the key of grasping the very essence of the Holocaust in the USSR, then we must approve of the decision by the editors volume 7 and 8 to include materials from 1941 of Nazi policy and the pogroms in East Galicia and the Bialystok region, along with some documents about the Soviet evacuation 1941-1942 and the reactions to the Holocaust and the anti-Semitism in the Soviet era. However, there are separate topics. Scholars of the Holocaust territory of the USSR have access to relatively few diaries and letters written under German and Romanian occupation. Such sources are particularly valuable for studying daily life as well as question of pertaining to the Jewish family, rumors, emotions, the desire for revenge, wartime folklore, memory, etc. In light of the understandable difficulty of finding diaries and letters from the occupation period, the number of eager documents that have been discovered and included in volumes 7 and 8 is really impressive. These texts are important because of the glimpse they give into the mindset of the writers and the messages they were trying to convey. When analyzing the materials on the Holocaust in the USSR, and the extensive corpus of the two volumes certainly justifies such an analysis. It would be interesting to try to determine whether there are any criteria for distinguishing personal documents dating to the occupation period from the first wave of testimonies, which were written either in the recently liberated Soviet lands by the Red Army or in partisan units in 1943-1945 for the liberation territories. This is particularly important in the case of the post-liberation documents created as part of the work of the ČGK State Extraordinary Commission that Bert mentioned, the MGB, Soviet State Security, and even the so-called Minsk Historical Commission. It is known that the materials for the ČGK were gathered by the NKVD personnel, as Bert said, and the eyewitnesses had to put their signature on every page as in criminal investigation, indicating that they were aware for the penalty for bearing false witness. Any person, even a Jew, who had spent time in occupied territory would have realized after the liberation that she or he was not just a witness, but also a suspected Nazi collaborator. This realization almost certainly affected the presentation of the material. In this context, we may assume that the testimonies mailed in 1933 to 1935 to the Krasная Zvezda newspaper, as well as those that were forwarded to Ilya Ehrenburg, a popular writer and journalist, who was regarded by most Jews as Jewish survivors as a spokesman of their innermost thoughts, were more sincere than those submitted to official bodies. Probably most such documents might be added to volumes. However, they too bear the imprint of changing circumstances. Then again, I should point out that the historical value of any given testimony for scholars of the Holocaust is not affected by the fact that it dates in the early period after liberation. It is just a question of how to read the text. As stated above, the number of authentic Jewish diaries from the occupation years is very small, as Bert also mentioned, and few of these texts adequately reflects the range of relevant issues. Lithuania and Eastern Poland are somewhat better represented in this respect, but even these regions offer slim picking for the scholars, especially for the small communities. As for the territory of the Soviet Union within the borders of 1939, the situation is sad indeed. Thus, Sarah Gleich's account on the events in Melitopol, which has been included in Volume 7, was mistakenly categorized as a diary by the Black Book editors. My colleague Shlomit Shulchani has determined that Gleich wrote the text 2 months later, after arriving in Stalingrad. Therefore, this so-called diary should more properly be categorized as part of the first wave of testimonies after liberation. The same is true of the diary of the young Lyalia Brook from the Minsk ghetto. She originally wrote it in the ghetto, then after moving to the Aryan side, she burned the text, fearing that it might give her away. Finally, she reconstructed the text from memory while serving in the partisan unit in territory that was de facto Soviet. In the Soviet context, with all documents and in many cases even the texts that were not intended for public consumption, subject of the rigorous ideological control by the state, access to the original documents is of paramount importance. As an example, let us consider the publication history of the farewell letter from Lithuania. This heartbreaking text was written in Polish by two women on behalf of a group of Jewish arrestees from Vilna, most probably on June 26, 1944, 3 weeks before the liberation. The Jews were staying in hiding, and the Polish women supplied them with food in exchange for money. When the money ran out, the women handed them over to the German authorities. After being brutally mistreated in the prison, the Jews were sent to Ponar. At road, they threw the letter out, hoping that some local residents would pick it up and pass it on the surviving Jews. Shortly after the liberation, an elderly Polish woman who had found the letter lying on the road handed it over to Yiddish poet Abraham Sutzkever. The poet would later recall that the letter had proved so shocking for the surviving of the Vilna ghetto that he decided to publish it as an appendix to his Yiddish language book, Von Vilna Ghetto, which came out in Moscow in 1946. The letter was reproduced here at a highly abridged version, as Sutzkever himself points out. Most of the excised passages contain detailed descriptions of sexual violence against children and adults, together with a harsh call for revenge against the woman who had betrayed them and against her children. The original of the letter was subsequently deposited in the Jewish Museum in Vilnius, which had been established in 1944, and that is probably why this document, along with other materials from the museum, ended up in archive in Vilnius. This is a version that is reproduced in Volume 7. In all likelihood, an authorized Russian language copy was submitted by the Jews to the MGB, Soviet State Security, in the same year, 1944. Another slightly abridged Russian translation, which is somewhat more detailed than the text in Sutzkever books, was being preserved in the archives of the Jewish Anti-Fascist Committee. A full Russian version is held in the archives of the Moscow FSB, former KGB, and it was published in Moscow in 2006. In this case, the Russian and German translation are generally coincide. Anyway, this document raised the general question: just how reliable are old publications and even certain archival copies? Moreover, how relevant is the material contained in them to Holocaust historians? I disagree with the attitude of blanket skepticism toward any and all Soviet sources. Instead of focusing on the passages that were omitted from the Sutzkever's publication, we should look at the parts that are still there. The document contains interesting information and, like many other farewell letters, is emotional, tinged. Sutzkever's version fairly accurately conveys the theme of the Holocaust and even the idea of revenge. However, because of the abridgment, possibly as a result of the deliberate Suskever's decision or editorial policy, the motive of vengeance is articulated more generally as revenge for all Jews. Hence, in text of this kind, the question of abridgment is relevant more to the understanding the working of the state censorship apparatus and the impact of the self-censorship than to the studying the transmission of knowledge about the Holocaust. For many, by no means all documents, the knowledge of that has already been amassed, including these 2 volumes, is sufficient to separate the authentic core from subsequent editorial editions or cutting. Let us hope that closer reading of the documents published in volumes 7 and 8 will significantly advance our understanding of these and many other questions. One thing is certain. Nowadays, there is no longer any cause for complaint about the dearth of published wartime archival materials in various genres on the history of the Holocaust in the USSR.
Yeah, thank you very much indeed to both of you.